Order. Questions to the Prime Minister. Mr. Kevin Brennan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Number one.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Mr. Kevin Brennan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I spoke yesterday to my constituent, Della Thompson, who, like the constituents of lots of colleagues across the House, was anxious because her son's passport hadn't arrived on time. Given the dreadful level of service she described to me, she was quite shocked to find that the Passport Agency returned a surplus of £73 million. What does it say about the values of his government that the Chancellor's actually making a profit out of our constituents' misery?
Money out of misery. Well, first of all, what I'd say to his constituent, and indeed any other constituent of any MP in this House, because this is an important issue, it is a difficult issue, we must get it right, is this: anyone who needs to travel within the next week and who's waited more than 3 weeks through no fault of their own will be fast-tracked for no extra cost so they can get their passport in time. Because I don't want anyone to miss their holiday because of these difficulties. In terms of what has happened, we've seen a 15% increase over the last week in the number of passports being processed, but we need to go faster, we need to hire more people, and the Home Secretary will be updating the House this afternoon.
Sir Peter Tapsell.
Is the Prime Minister aware of the growing sentiment that, as the publication of the Chilcot report has been so long delayed, the ancient but still existing power of backbenchers to commence the procedures of impeachment should now be activated to bring Mr. Tony Blair to account for allegedly misleading the House on the necessity of the invasion of Iraq in 2003.
Prime Minister.
What I would say to my right honourable friend and father of the House, it is important that we see the results of the Iraq inquiry. It has had access to all of the papers, to all of the officials, to all of the ministers. And frankly, what I would say is if the Iraq inquiry had started when this party, and indeed when the Liberal Democrats suggested it, then actually we would have seen the Iraq inquiry published by now. But members opposite, including, incidentally, the Leader of the Opposition, voted against starting the Iraq inquiry on no fewer than 4 occasions.
Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, all of us will have been appalled by the images of the brutal aggression of ISIS that has spread across Iraq, terrorising its citizens, undermining its fragile democracy. Iraq is today facing fundamental threats to its integrity, security and stability. Can the Prime Minister provide the House with his latest assessment of the situation in Iraq? And following the welcome appearance yesterday of Prime Minister Maliki with Kurdish and Sunni representatives calling for national unity, can he say what more he believes can be done to encourage a more inclusive and representative government, which is essential for the future of Iraq?
Prime Minister.
Well, first of all, the Leader of the Opposition is absolutely right that one of the crucial things that needs to happen is for the Iraqi government to take a more inclusive approach towards Shia, Sunni and Kurd as the important constituent parts of Iraq. I can tell the House that the latest reports indicate that fighting is continuing on a front from Samarra to Bakuba. The Baijay oil refinery in Tikrit is currently under attack by ISIL. The Peshmerga are fighting ISIL in Diyala province. But meanwhile, there is this large-scale recruitment not only of Shia militias, but also of other young recruits to the Iraqi armed forces, and it is vital that that proceeds and that ISIL is pushed back by the Iraqis. But the absolutely key thing to recognise here is that when you get this combination of poor governance, of ungoverned spaces and support for extremism, that provides an opportunity for the terrorists, and we have to address this on each of those 3 fronts, supporting the Iraqi government with the work that they need to do.
Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, I agree with the Prime Minister. This crisis, though, is not just affecting Iraq, but has consequences for the whole world, including the UK. Can he tell us the extra measures the government is taking and contemplating, including through the Border Agency and the Home Office, to ensure that British nationals in the region cannot return here and engage in violent extremism or terrorism? And can he say what the government is doing to prevent people in this country becoming radicalised and travelling to the region in order to fight?
Well, I believe this is the correct focus. As I said yesterday, our approach to this issue must be based on a hard-headed assessment of our national interest. And most important of all is how to keep our citizens safe here at home. Now, the Leader of the Opposition asked specifically about the action that we're taking. We will be legislating in this session of Parliament to make the planning of terrorist attacks overseas illegal here in the UK. We'll be making sure that our security, intelligence and policing resources are focused particularly on this part of the world and the danger of British people travelling there, becoming radicalised and returning to the UK. We've already stopped a number of people travelling. We've taken away passports, including using the new powers that we legislated for in the last Parliament, and we'll continue to do everything we can to keep our country safe.
Because the Prime Minister will have our full support in doing so, and if there are further measures, we will also obviously look at those. I want to talk about Iran and its role in this crisis. We support the announcement made yesterday by the Foreign Secretary to reopen the British Embassy in Tehran and the dialogue started by the Foreign Secretary with his counterpart. But the challenge we face in Iraq is that although Iran opposes ISIS, the Iranian regime in the past has shown that it does not support a vision for an inclusive and democratic state in Iraq. So can he give the House his current assessment, and indeed the government's, of the willingness and intent of the current Iranian regime to play a constructive rather than divisive role in helping to resolve the Iraqi crisis?
Well, I'll make, first of all, I'm grateful for the cross-party approach on this, and I'll make 2 points. First of all, I think it is important to re-engage with dialogue with Iran, and that is why we are planning to reopen the embassy. I think it should be done on a step-by-step basis. As I said, it should be done with a very clear eye and a very hard head, because we know of the appalling things that happened to our embassy back in 2011. To people who say there's some sort of inconsistency with having dialogue with Iran while at the same time recognising how much they've done to destabilise the region, I would say we need to take a consistent approach with all the players in this region, which is to say that we support the voices of moderation, the voices that support democracy, inclusive government, pluralistic politics under the rule of law. And we need the Iranian government to play that role as well as everybody else.
Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, the broader context of this is, of course, the wider Sunni-Shiite schism across the region. Does he agree with me that it's not just Iran, but other significant countries across the region that have a huge responsibility not to take steps that will further fuel this sectarian conflict? And, Mr. Speaker, that includes support for extremist groups, including ISIS. Will the Prime Minister make clear in his conversations with all countries in the region that that will simply fuel the conflict?
I think that is absolutely right, that whatever we are looking to do, whether it is to support the voices of moderation and democracy in Syria, whether it is trying to help the Iraqi government close down this ungoverned space in Iraq, or indeed the conversations we have with other regional players, it's very important that we're consistent with that engagement and that we oppose extremism, terrorism and violence. And let me just reassure the House that when it comes to the support that we have given to rebels in Syria, that we do that through the official Syrian opposition who are committed to those things and not to extremism, violence and terrorism. And our engagement with the Saudi Arabians, with Qataris, with Emiratis and others is all on the basis that none of us should be supporting those violent terrorists or extremists.
Ed Miliband.
I want to ask about the humanitarian situation in the region, the consequences of what's happening in Iraq. We have British allies in the region, such as Jordan, that are already dealing with a huge refugee crisis, and events in Iraq threaten to make that worse. Britain is doing a good job of providing welcome humanitarian support for those in the refugee camps. But, Mr. Speaker, there are more refugees outside the camps than inside the camps. What further practical measures does the Prime Minister believe we can take to support countries like Jordan and like Lebanon affected by this crisis?
Well, first of all, let me update the House, because we remain, when it comes to Syria and the Syrian refugee situation, we remain the second largest bilateral aid donor anywhere in the world, which I think is something Britain can be proud of. We are providing shelter, food, clothing and support for the millions of people who have been made homeless by that conflict. When it comes to supporting the neighbouring countries, we have given some direct help to Jordan because the increase of the population in Jordan and indeed in Lebanon is equivalent effectively, if we think about it in our own terms, of almost 15 million people coming here to the UK. In terms of the Iraq humanitarian situation, where there is an emerging humanitarian problem because of people being displaced because of the ISIL murderous regime, we've already announced £3 million of aid, humanitarian aid, to people displaced in that region, and I can announce today we'll be increasing that to £5 million. So yet again, Britain will be playing its role for those who, no fault of their own, have been displaced by conflict and who face a very, very difficult situation.
I welcome that, and I hope you will continue to look at what more can be done for those outside the camps and support the infrastructure in countries like Jordan. Let me just say this finally, Mr. Speaker. Everything we are seeing across this region begs a fundamental question about whether it can develop a politics where people live alongside each other as citizens rather than dividing along sectarian, ethnic or religious lines. And does he finally agree with me that while we can and should provide assistance to make that happen, in the end, it is about the political will of those in the region that will determine whether this happens or not?
I agree with the right honourable gentleman that I think it would be a mistake to believe that the only answer to these problems is the hard attack of direct intervention. We know that that can create problems of itself, but I'd also disagree with those people who think this is nothing to do with us, and if they want to have some sort of extreme Islamist regime in the middle of Iraq, that won't affect us. It will. The people in that regime, as well as trying to take territory, are also planning to attack us here at home in the United Kingdom. So the right answer is to be long-term, hard-headed, patient and intelligent with the interventions that we make, and the most important intervention of all is to make sure that these governments are fully representative of the people who live in their countries, that they close down the ungoverned space and they remove the support for the extremists. If we do that, not just in Syria, but we have to help in Iraq, in Somalia, in Nigeria, in Mali, because these problems will come back and hit us at home if we don't.
Sir Richard Harrington.
Mr. Speaker, this week construction begins on Watford's new UTC, University Technical College, sponsored by Mellor Education Trust. And in it, students will receive first-class academic education, but also real preparation for real jobs in the real world. And would the Prime Minister encourage young people in Watford to explore the opportunities that this wonderful new school will offer?
Well, what I can say to my honourable friend is I know that we're doing all we can to help get the Watford University Technical College ready to open its doors in September so that students can start to benefit. What I would say, having visited these technical colleges now in Harlow, in Staffordshire, I think they represent filling in one of the missing links in our education system that was left after the Second World War, where ironically we helped the Germans establish good technical schools but didn't put them in place here in the United Kingdom. And I'm very proud to be leading a government that's putting that right.
Natasha Engel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. 3 large GP practices in the most deprived areas of North East Derbyshire are facing crisis. In England, we are at least 10,000 GPs short of what we need, so it's no surprise that people can't get an appointment. Labour is promising a maximum 48-hour wait to see a GP. What's he promising?
What I'd say to the Honourable Lady is, first of all, in order to provide more GPs, we need to provide money. And this government has increased spending on the NHS when we were told by the party opposite it was irresponsible. And what you see in our NHS today is 7,000 more doctors, more nurses, more midwives, but 19,000 fewer bureaucrats. And I think that is absolutely vital in providing the health services that we need.
Charlotte Leslie.
I'm awaiting a detailed response from him about a dire pollution event in Avonmouth, my constituency. But will he welcome the happier news that just up the river, we're in the midst of a volunteering week of action renovating the historic Lamplighters Pub, closed under Enterprise Inns in 2009, but now reopening thanks to the determination of local residents and new owners Kathy and Dominic Gundry-White. will he welcome all the jobs, community spirit and real ale that will bring?
I will delighted to welcome that real ale and of course recommend that they take advantage of the 1p cut, not just in this budget but also in the previous budget. I know that people in Avonmouth have suffered unacceptably from this air pollution problem and are very happy to discuss that with her. In terms of community pubs, I think we're seeing a growth in terms of community pubs and I think that is all to the good, and it's welcome of course that we introduced the community right to bid that has enabled a number of communities to take hold of these facilities and operate them for the use of the public.
Mr. Nick Rainsford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In its recent report on the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Woolwich, the CQC praised the staff for being kind, caring and respectful, but highlighted serious capacity constraints in the A&E department. Does the Prime Minister remember that a year ago, before being stopped by judicial review, his government were proposing to close the A&E department in the neighbouring Lewisham Hospital, which would have added massively to the pressures on the already overstretched Queen Elizabeth? What lessons have been learnt from that serious error of judgment?
I think that the most important thing with our health service is to praise good service when we see it, but to recognise where you see poor service, it has to be turned around. And we are very clear about the turnaround work that is being done in many of our hospitals that were left for year after year under Labour. But the House might be interested to know, that the average amount of time you wait in A&E was 77 minutes when Labour were in power. It is now 30 minutes under this government.
Dr. Matthew Offord.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Prime Minister advise my constituents what action the government is taking to ensure that areas of regeneration such as Colindale in my constituency receive the necessary public service infrastructure to support the increase in population?
No, well, my honourable friend makes an important point, and obviously things like the new homes bonus have helped to make sure that local authorities can put in place infrastructure. We have revised and strengthened new planning guidance to ensure that infrastructure is provided to support new development. And my honourable friend will also know that as a result of the recent award of the Thameslink franchise, there will be new rolling stock on the line, and by the end of 2018, there will be over 3,000 more seats on trains running through Hendon at peak times, which I hope is welcome to his constituents.
Nicholas Brown.
What does the Prime Minister believe are the underlying causes for the £2 billion deficit forecast for the English National Health Service trusts for next year, and what are his remedies?
The estimates being made today are being made on the basis that we have set challenges for the NHS in terms of making efficiencies. And what I can report to the House after 4 years in government is they have met those efficiency challenges every single year under this government, and that money has been ploughed back into better patient care in our NHS. The great question for the NHS in British politics today, I would argue, is why is it in Wales, where Labour are under control, where 8% cuts have been made in the NHS budget? Well, they might be yawning opposite. They're not yawning in Wales because they're stuck on waiting lists, desperate for treatment.
Mr. Speaker, will my right honourable friend join me in congratulating the England women's football team for the success in the World Cup qualifiers? On and off the pitch, women are delivering for England, with more women in employment, more women setting up businesses than in 2010. So will the Prime Minister confirm that in our long-term economic plan, we will ensure that women can continue to score the goals for the UK economy and that no one is left behind?
I'm very happy to join my honourable friend as a keen fan of not just the England football team but also the England cricket team. I've actually had the great pleasure of having representatives of the England women's football and cricket team in Downing Street recently, and I made the point to them they seem to put us through considerably less heartache, stress and worry when they are qualifying for these major competitions, and indeed in the cricket team's case when they are winning the Ashes. Look, I think there is some good news to celebrate, which is female employment is at a record high in our country. There are nearly 700,000 more women in work than at the election. We're seeing more women entrepreneurs starting up businesses. We're making sure that it's fairer for women in terms of pensions. I believe this government has a good record, but there's always more to be done.
This is Margaret Ritchie.
Mr. Speaker, Exactly 20 years ago to the day, gunmen went into a pub in my constituency in a place called Loughin Island and killed 6 men amid widespread claims about collusion and police cover-up. The families have never received truth and justice. Only 2 weeks ago, the police ensured that the Police Ombudsman's investigation was stalled. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that all UK police services must cooperate fully with their oversight authorities, both to the letter and the spirit, to ensure that families that I represent in Loughin Island receive truth and justice?
Minister. No, I agree with the Honourable Lady that everyone should cooperate with the Police Ombudsman, and I believe the Police Ombudsman system in Northern Ireland is actually now a model that other countries are looking to follow, and something I discussed quite recently with the Taoiseach in terms of what happens in the Republic of Ireland. So we have got a system there that works. We have the historical inquiry teams which are also working, but I very much hope that the work can continue between the parties in Northern Ireland to discuss the Haas principles and the Haas ideas for flags, parades and the past, and I hope that everyone can come together and sort these issues out.
Mr. Raymond Chishti.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Gillingham and Raynham, youth unemployment is down, unemployment overall is down, business creation is up, business creation is up. And what I would say to the Prime Minister, does he not agree with me that this clearly shows that our long-term economic plan is working? And linked to that, will the Prime Minister join with me in welcoming the new creation of a university technical college in Medway, which will ensure that our future generations have the right skills to succeed in life?
I'm delighted to say to the honourable gentleman that it is welcome that youth unemployment, which has been too high for too long in our country, is down by 25% this year in his constituency, and long-term youth unemployment is down 41%. He makes the point as well about these university technical colleges. I want to see one of these in every major town in our country, so we really give young people the opportunity of a good technical education if that is what they choose, and that those schools are well funded, well-resourced and also partnered, as is in his case, partnered with good organisations that can bring their expertise to bear.
Bradshaw.
How is his campaign going to stop Mr. Juncker?
Well, it's a simple issue of principle. It's a simple issue of principle, much more connected to the principle than the name. And the principle is this, and I think it will be shared on every side of the House, that the members of the European Council, who are the elected Prime Ministers and the elected Presidents under the treaties, we should choose who runs the European Commission. And I don't mind how many people on the European Council disagree with me. I will fight this right to the very end. What I would say to my colleagues on the European Council, many of whom have expressed interesting views about both this principle and this person, if you want reform in Europe, you've got to stand up for it. If you want to change in Europe, you've got to vote for it. That is the message that I will take, and that is the right message for our country.
Mr. Speaker, last year a Cabinet Office minister said relocation of staff out of expensive London offices to other regions continues to be high on the agenda to deliver the savings needed. Will the Prime Minister look to move some of those jobs to Redcar and Cleveland, where we have low-cost offices, affordable housing, school places, people ready to work and a great lifestyle?
No, well, my honourable friend makes an important point about the relocation of jobs, and of course we want to see that develop. I know it was disappointing about the changes to the insolvency service in Stockton last year, but one of the reasons that happened is because there has been such a sharp fall in bankruptcy and company closures, which is a welcome development. Overall, as he knows, employment is rising in the North East, rising by 47,000 last year, but we need to make sure we generate not just private sector jobs, but where we can sensibly locate public sector jobs to different parts of the country, we continue with that programme.
Liz Kendall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How many people from this country are fighting for ISIS, and what risk do they pose to the UK?
Well, the estimates that have been given so far is that around 400 people from the UK have taken part in fighting with ISIS, but those numbers are much more based around what is happening in Syria rather than what is happening in Iraq, where we have considerably less information. What I can say to the Honourable Lady is, together with the Home Secretary and others, I've chaired a series of meetings in Whitehall to make sure that our intelligence, security and policing services are focused as sharply as they can onto this problem. The estimates are now that this is a greater threat to the UK than the return of foreign jihadis or fighters from the Afghanistan or Pakistan region, and we need to make sure we're doing everything we can, as I said, to keep our country safe.
Mr. David Nuttall. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst it is good news that the budget deficit has been cut by a third, there is still much more to do. One way of helping our country live within its means is to send back all the convicted criminals who are foreign nationals and who are costing British taxpayers hundreds of millions of pounds each year to keep in our prisons. All too often, attempts to send back these criminals are scuppered by human rights legislation. What plans does the Prime Minister have to put an end to this ludicrous state of affairs?
Minister! Well, what I'd say to my honourable friend is I absolutely agree we need to do more on this front. We have removed around 20,000 foreign national offenders since this government came to office, but the number is still too high. I have allotted individual ministers to individual territories, particularly those with the highest number of foreign offenders, so countries like Nigeria, Jamaica, Vietnam, China, to make sure we make progress on returning these prisoners. We also need to use the prisoner transfer agreement within the European Union, because that could lead to a large return of prisoners, not least to Poland. But we have to keep up the pressure on this, and I also believe if we get a Conservative government after the next election, we will have a substantive reform to the Human Rights Act, which is not working properly for Britain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last month, the National Health Service missed its cancer treatment target for the very first time. What does the Prime Minister have to say to patients and their families who've had to put their lives on hold, waiting for vital treatment to start?
Well, what I say, look, there isn't a family in this country that isn't affected by cancer and the difficulties of making sure you get the treatment that you need as fast as you can. We have a series of targets for cancer treatment, and we are meeting almost all of them. We've seen an increase in terms of 15% in terms of the number of people that are being treated for cancer. And of course, we've introduced something that never existed under the previous government, and that is the Cancer Drugs Fund. And she will probably know people in her own constituency, just as I know people in my constituency, who are getting medicines that they need that they never got before.
T. Patel.
The Prime Minister will know that the economic recovery in Essex has been led by the private sector, with Essex firms creating thousands of new jobs and exporting across the globe. Will he commend Essex businesses and also support their efforts to export more by looking favourably upon our plans to upgrade our infrastructure, both our road and rail network across Essex?
Well, as I've said before, where Essex leads, the rest of the country follows. And in terms of economic recovery, private sector growth, entrepreneurialism, employing more people, that is exactly what the economy needs. That is what our economic plan is delivering. Last week we saw that record increase in employment. This week we've seen inflation fall to a 5-year low. I had very successful meetings yesterday with the Chinese Premier, signing £14 billion worth of important deals that will bring jobs, growth and investment to this country. But we've got to keep working on every aspect of our plan, including improving exports to the fastest growing countries in the world.
Gisela Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The former Prime Minister, Sir John Major, made a very strong case for looking at our constitutional arrangements, whatever the outcome, in September in Scotland. Yes. Will he accept that devolution in England outside London is very much unfinished business? If our great cities like Birmingham want to remain the economic engines, we require radically reformed funding structures, and our regions require strategically elected direct mayors.
Well, as the Honourable Lady knows, I'm a fan of directly elected mayors, but the people of Birmingham had the chance to make that decision and they voted not to have a mayor. I hope that people will see successful mayors in London, in Liverpool, in Bristol, and other parts of our country, and they will see there are real benefits from that. But where I agree with her is even if we don't move to a mayoral system, there's more we can do through city deals, through local enterprise partnerships, through devolving some of the funding in Whitehall further down towards cities and regions. All would be to the good. And what I think is worthwhile and welcome is the fact that her party has not decided to tear up in its policy review local enterprise partnerships, but instead to extend them. And I think it's good that we have cross-party agreement on how to drive this devolution to our great cities around the country.
Michael Fabricant.
On behalf of my Burntwood constituents, may I thank, may I thank the Prime Minister for his swift and effective action in giving what is in effect a posthumous honour to my constituent Stephen Sutton. But with the economic plan now working well, how can we build on that, and how can we build on the legacy that Stephen Sutton set for giving to charitable purposes?
Well, Stephen was an absolutely inspiring individual, and his zest for life, even as he was suffering from a very difficult and progressive cancer, was completely extraordinary and very inspiring. He raised a huge amount of money for teenage cancer services and raised it from right around the world as well as the UK. I think it's right that our honours system does properly reward people that give to charity, that give of their time from the very bottom to the very top. And I think there's probably more we can do to make sure that our honours system really reflects what the British public want, which is to see giving, generosity and compassion rewarded.
Yasmin Qureshi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister may recollect that a few months ago, at Prime Minister's questions, I asked him to meet the victims of the drug Primadose. There are over 50 of them coming to Parliament today, and I would ask if you would see them, look at the documents that we produced to show that the then Committee of Medicine knew about the fact that this drug was causing deformities in babies and nothing was done about it. And I would ask if you would then consider a public inquiry.
Well, I don't think I'll be able, I'm afraid, today to see her constituents and the people she's bringing to the House of Commons. I'm very happy to have another conversation with her about what can be done and to understand what more can be communicated to these people. So perhaps we can fix that up.
Ms Anne McIntosh.
Mr. Speaker, in welcoming the Chinese Premier, Mr. Li, to this country, and in recognising that China is one of the greatest export markets for Britain, can I ask the Prime Minister to use his good offices to unblock the barrier to the export of pig's feet for human consumption, which will bring thousands of pounds and ensure the long-term economic growth of North Yorkshire?
I will certainly take up my honourable friend on that issue. I recall on a previous visit to China, we unlocked the export of pig semen to China, so we made progress. I seem to remember the press release referred to the Pig Society, so, sorry about that one. But so I will look very carefully at pig feet, and if exports can be allowed and if jobs can be promoted by that, I'd be very happy to help.
Clark.
Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding serious problems elsewhere, does the Prime Minister share my concern about the crisis in South Sudan, where 4 million people are facing famine? What steps are being taken to implement the peace process?
Prime Minister. I was discussing this issue yesterday with the Archbishop of Canterbury, who very bravely had himself been with local church leaders to the town of Bor, which had been the subject of some of the most serious fighting. In a way, it's a very different part of the world to what we were discussing earlier, but some of the same rules apply. We need a government that governs on behalf of all the people in that country, Dinka and Nuer, and does not try to divide the country along ethnic lines. We will do what we can, again, and when we talk about intervention in this country, it's intervention through diplomacy, through aid, through assistance, through advice, and we'll continue to do that good work.
Sir William Cash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is my right honourable friend aware that at the conference this weekend in Athens of the national chairman of the European Select Committees with delegates from all parties, but also chairmen of the European parliamentary committees as well, that the British delegation defeated an attempt to treat the word Euroscepticism as equivalent to xenophobia and racism. And furthermore, that on the question of the procedure, the unprecedented procedure relating to the proposed appointment or election of Mr. Juncker, that the conference also agreed with the British delegation that this was an unprecedented and unacceptable and unsuccessful procedure.
That's right. Well, no surprises that my honourable friend was successful in this very important negotiation on behalf of Britain, and there is support right around Europe for the concept of the Council of Ministers making these choices. But as I say, it requires the elected Prime Ministers and Presidents to vote in the way that they believe.
We've been slightly delayed, but there are accommodations that I want today to make. Rajnara Ali.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the Prime Minister's watch, 5 GP surgeries face closure in my borough and 98 nationally. Is this what the Prime Minister meant when he promised to protect the NHS?
What I meant when I said we protect the NHS is just that. We are spending £12.7 billion more on the NHS, which Labour said was irresponsible. We have 7,000 more doctors in our NHS. We have 3,000 more nurses in our NHS. We have over 1,000 more midwives in our NHS. But there is something we have less of in our NHS, and we have 19,000 fewer bureaucrats. And that money has been piled into patient care, including improving primary care right around the country.
Mr. Robert Jenrick.
The people of Newark have enjoyed becoming better acquainted with the Prime Minister this past month. I regret to inform the Prime Minister that the town of Southwell in my constituency was again flooded last week. Would the Prime Minister reaffirm his commitment to support my proposal that those parts of Nottinghamshire that were severely affected by the floods of 2013 receive similar grants to those parts elsewhere in the country flooded at the beginning of this year?
Well, first of all, can I welcome my honourable friend to his place in the House of Commons after what was a long, arduous but well-fought and very positive by-election campaign. My honourable friend makes an important point, which is there are parts of the country, in Nottinghamshire but also elsewhere, that flooded during the course of 2013 that weren't eligible for some of the payments made subsequent to the flooding at the turn of the last year. So support for householders, farmers and other sorts of proposals. We're looking very hard at this as whether we can put back to the beginning of the 2013 financial year the eligibility criteria for that flood work. I'll look at it very carefully. I will talk with my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for the local government and communities, and see if we can resolve this issue for my honourable friend.
Order.